Hello again and welcome to The Luxury of Choice, a B2B technical sales and business podcast brought to you by the training team of George James Limited. My name is Steve Vaughan, I'm a member of the training team and I'm also the host and producer of this podcast. Today I've got my colleague Christian Walter with me, but we've also got a very important special guest. More on that to follow very quickly. But Christian, first of all, how are you, sir?
Yes, thank you. Very good. Busy week, busy training, good training. So happy to be
Literally just hot-footed
here.
out of the training to join the pod, which I do appreciate you doing. So look, I'm going to get straight into today. Today's show is a bit different to our normal sort of panel discussion. We do have a guest, and today's going to be much more of a discussion and almost of an interview, really, of somebody that we've been wanting to talk to on the podcast for quite a while now. So I'm just going to briefly introduce him. Our guest today is Hamid Ghanadan, founder of the Linus Group and author of Persuading Scientists. Hamid started his career as a biochemist before moving into the world of marketing and commercial strategy. For years, he studied a question that sits at the heart of many of our listeners' worlds. How do scientists, engineers, and technical experts make buying decisions? If you've ever sold into laboratories, pharma, biotech, diagnostics, or any other technical demanding environment, this conversation is definitely going to be for you. Hamid, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. How are you?
It is my pleasure. I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, good. So we should point out you're in North America, so I think you're 6 hours time difference to us.
That's right.
So
9:20 a.m. for me right now, and
thank you.
it is a lovely day in Boulder, Colorado. So
I would love to say it's a lovely day in Oxfordshire, but I would not be telling the truth. It's raining and cloudy as always. We had a brief spell of sunny weather, but that's long since gone. But let's get straight into it today. So I'm very keen for you to tell us a lot more about yourself and your journey. So first of all, just tell us a bit about yourself. So you started as a biochemist, is that right? Yeah,
I did. So it was the early mid 90s when I graduated college as a chemist, and I was working as a researcher at a lab in a university. And it was when the internet was starting to become a thing, and I also noticed around me that people weren't making decisions the way that they said they were making decisions. So in science, as you all know, everyone says the data rule. You have to, show ample evidence. And I was looking around me and I was like, okay, well, this is you're saying this, but you're not really making decisions based on the data alone. So what else is going on? And little did I know, I was actually sort of peering into the world of consumer psychology at that time. But that's essentially the question that really drove me to want to pursue a different career than being a lab scientist.
What was the final thing that made you make that change, and then what led you to becoming an author? You've got a number of books published now, but what was the thing that really made that first step out of, I can see how there's a story to be told here. There's something different going on here. When was the first step you realized that really?
So I was very interested in at the time, the new technologies, the communication technologies that were really coming online with the internet, obviously, but also with how much easier it was to use software for animation. And I was actually developing animations for myself to illustrate biochemical processes. And I had a friend at the department who was teaching a general biochemistry course. And when I showed these animations to him, he was gobsmacked. He was like, "Can I use these for my course?" And so I gave them to him, and he won an award for being an innovative teacher for that year.
Wow.
He put me in touch with a publisher of textbooks, and I was very excited to have this meeting because I thought, okay, I can create a compendium to these biochemistry textbooks that would bring things to life in far more than just two dimensions. And so I flew down. I wore my best suit. I was 23 at the time, right? I wore my best suit and I flew down to the San Francisco Bay Area, and I went to this publishing house and I met with the person who was in charge of the biochemistry textbooks. And I walked out of there with the threat of a lawsuit.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I thought I was gonna get a job or something interesting, and they were like, "Yeah, we are very afraid of electronic communication because we're afraid of piracy and it would hurt textbook sales. And just to warn you, if you continue to do this on your own, we may actually pursue legal action against you." And I was so angry. I was like, who are these people? And so I realized quickly that the publishing world wasn't really a place where it was going to be welcoming to some novel ideas. But I found a home in the companies that were selling to scientists. So the the instrument manufacturers and the sort of research tools providers were quite hungry actually for better tools to communicate their
So what time? What kind of period was this? What kind of year was this?
like 1994, 1995.
Yeah.
I mean, this
I'm
was
sure Christian
times
would
when
remember that as well. Yeah, that was
when
time.
I was calling on
Yeah,
companies, some companies that you would have heard of today said to me that having a website is beyond our scope. Like, we're never going to have a website. I mean, it's preposterous to think that, but these are companies that would say that to me at the
I
time.
can
So
remember the
that's sort of
conversations.
how, yeah, yeah. So, but that's what
Yeah,
did it.
I mean,
That's what did it. That trip down to
right.
the Bay Area and having that unpleasant conversation with a publishing firm.
Yeah, I mean, both Christian and I were working for instrument companies at that time, and we were. I'm sure Christian, and we were working for the same company. I can remember you and I probably having those conversations right there and there about the marketing world and this strange thing called the internet coming into the world. Yeah.
Absolutely,
So
yes.
so how did then that? So you kind of bumped up against the publishing world, the traditional print media. They kind of said, "Get out of our space, otherwise we've got to sue you." How did that then come to you then becoming a published author in your own right?
Yeah.
What's
So
the
the
step to
author.
there?
So I left the lab and I started the consulting firm Linus, which is still
Okay.
I'm still the CEO of. And it wasn't until about the publishing of the book of the first book, which was Persuading Scientists, didn't happen until 2011. But what happened in the intervening time from 2001 to 2012, we started to publish these critical briefings papers, and this was all of our critical thinking on basically the psychology of the scientific customer, as well as the evolution of all the tools and techniques that were coming online, all for in marketing and sales. So I remember publishing a paper about how Google AdWords were going to overtake all marketing. And I remember sending this to people, and a VP of marketing from a really large company called me and said, "How much can we pay you to not publish this paper?" And
No way.
because they wanted to maintain, they found it so powerful that they wanted to keep it as a secret. And so I became really used to publishing and really developing sort of a framework around this. And then by 2011 we had a framework that we were using, and that's when we started to publish. I published the first book, Persuading Scientists. And so there was about a decade of writing these, sort of pithy papers that led to that.
Fascinating, fascinating. So, what is it about the psychology of scientific and technical buyers? You've alluded to this already, but what is it that when we're selling, as we do, as most people on this podcast listening to us, what is it about the psychology of scientists and technical buyers that makes it different to other B2B sales and business people? What is different about them? What makes it different? Because it is, I'm sure.
Sure. So there's two axes that play. One is just the human axis, which is the fact that they evaluate things both from an objective lens and a subjective lens, and so you can't really ignore emotion in a highly technical sale. But the moniker that we have given to the scientists as a buyer is that they're the world's most skeptical audience, and they are in fact very skeptical because they have been taught through their scientific training to keep information in contempt until they prove it to themselves that's real and useful and true. However, skepticism isn't the only. Skepticism is on a spectrum, and the other side of that is curiosity. So if every scientist was always skeptical all the time, we would still, as a species, be on like Discovery 1.0, because we were shot everything down. And so there's another aspect to it, this openness, this curiosity. And if you map these two things together is what makes scientists and other technical audiences different as a buyer. Is that
Fascinating.
is that so you can actually drive them to become curious when you want them to become curious, and then you can satisfy their skepticism. You need to, appeal to their emotion or their subjective lens as well as their objective lens, or else you're just sort of giving rote information to them and they're not emotionally invested in the outcome.
Christian, by the way, feel free to interrupt me or chip in with
Yeah,
a
I
question.
just I just want to maybe challenge you a little bit on that, Hamid.
Go for it.
I am a scientist, and I agree that continuum between curiosity and validation, or curiosity and skepticism, and data driven. Do you really think that non-scientists are all that different in their decision making?
They're different in two ways. So first of all, it's not that non-scientists are different. It's people who are not in a technical setting. So a physician, for example, in work at work displays the exact same situation, but it's different than lay consumerism. It's different than, because there's two things that are not at play. So number one, the difference becomes that these people are trained in evaluating information, whereas a layperson may not be trained in evaluating, information. And so that's why you see bottles of shampoo that says like it has DNA, and people are like, "Ooh, that sounds great," like whatever, like just nonsensical things that to somebody who studied science, you're like, that DNA is even spinning the wrong way. Like, get out of my way. So there's this a level of scrutiny that a scientist or an engineer or a doctor has that's above and beyond. But the problem is that when we go into sales and marketing, we think that's the enemy. And so we're ready to sort of like, we're ready with ample evidence. We're just ready for that skepticism, that we forget to actually orient the customer. We forget to appeal to their sense of self, right? The what's in it for me. We forget to answer that question, and we just go right into trying to validate their skepticism. And all we're doing is keeping them in that skeptical mode. You see what I mean? Like that's where the misnomer comes in. But I appreciate the challenge.
So
That's great.
Hamid, my wife says about me that the more people try to convince me, the less convincible I am. I guess that's a little bit what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, we are in a moment in history where we have more information at our fingertips than ever before. Would you say that that's true? Okay.
Completely.
Look at how we're acting. So information is not really a driver of change. And then we see people shouting at each other. And I would be willing to bet not a single mind has been changed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that takes information and digests it, is a path of high resistance. But there's the rest of the body, and the rest of the body is all ready for new experiences. And I think
So true.
that's kind of the difference. It's
So
just
I'm
we
just
just
sitting here
try to convince too much.
I'm
Go
just
ahead,
sitting here
Steve.
thinking now. So I've just bought a new car the last 2 days, not new, but new to me, and decided I wanted it a bit smaller and a bit more frugal. And I've got all the data out, and I got ChatGPT, other AI apps are available, of course, analyzing fuel consumption and the cost and all that stuff. And I got all this data at my fingertips, and I made all this evaluation decision. But at the end of the day, I just bought it because I like the color.
Yeah.
And it looked cool, and I quite like it because it's a bit different, and it's not like everybody else is driving. So it's so true. I'm a scientist, Woods, as well, and I made lots of technical input, but ultimately it was my feelings and my emotions that led to why I made that decision. So what you're saying is it's the same when people are in work; they make the same processes, the same conclusions. Yeah,
I
Absolutely.
love the neurological element you're bringing into this. The fact that actually it is maybe also because we're wired that way, and there's a resistance to change, and shouting evidence at each other doesn't help. I mean, you can see that between our politicians from the different camps. They shout
yeah.
evidences at each other, and nothing ever
Nothing
happens.
changes.
So
Yeah.
you're talking about curiosity, sparking the curiosity. So how do we do that?
So you have to welcome people in, and that's where you need an insight. I call it a secret. You need a secret about your customer. And that secret has to be an insight about a need or an opportunity that they have, but maybe they don't see, or they don't see it in the way that you do.
Mhm.
And so in there's many different sales models. The challenger sales model is similar to this, but it's a little, in my opinion, it's a little like formulaic. But the idea here is that you spark their curiosity by giving them something novel and new to think about, but that it has emotional charge to it. So what do I mean by that? You can go there and give them novel information, but they have to resonate with it personally. Like there has to be something that's like, wait a minute, what I just heard or experienced, it could affect me either in a positive or a negative way. That's how you drive their curiosity. You're just basically, it's something provocative that is also personally tailored to them. In sales, you can personally tailor that to them. So you want to start the sales process by orienting the customer, and then bringing them clearly into that curiosity zone, getting them out of their skepticism. So the one of the issues that and this is actually their psychology behind this. So when a sales rep starts a call, they're playing the role of a sales rep. And so the customer assumes the role of the customer with all of the stereotypes and all the trappings that go with that. That's basically priming effect. You are primed to act a certain way. And the most successful thing that a salesperson can do in those first few minutes is to break themselves out of that primed role of I'm a salesperson, and then the customer will mirror that, and then they will break their role out of being
So you meant
acting a certain way.
you mentioned challenger, and I mean, I quite like the challenge, take the customer out of their comfort zone. Don't always be humble and polite, but maybe say, hey, you could do that actually much better. I had one of my best sales reps was like that, and he clearly shook people up and said, hey, this is not the best way you're doing this. I've seen it done much better. Is this what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a very good example. That's a typical example of what we're looking for. In sales, that sales rep, if they're observant, right? And if they're going in and they're observant and they're listening, they can be very effective at picking that up and then delivering the challenge or the provocation, on the spot, tailored personally to their customer. With marketing, it becomes harder because you have to have an insight. So you have to do research. You have to understand, okay, this is the need. We need to reorient the market to think this way. And then here's all the information on the back end to help them make it personal and believable so that when our sales rep goes in to persuade, they're already conditioned the way that we want to be
Absolutely.
conditioned.
So without making this a comparison of different training methodologies, because it would be a long podcast if we do that, but in terms of somebody listening to this now who's thinking, this is making sense to me. I want to be much more of a consultant, whatever word we want to use, really. What's one or two practical things that they could do as a result of, your suggestions, obviously reading your practical books as well? What practical things could they do in their next call?
So I'll share a couple of things. So one of the things that we've analyzed is that a salesperson is most vulnerable in 4 stages 4 moments in the sales cycle. The first one is how they open. In fact, how they open the conversation, they're vulnerable in that moment. The second one is how they deliver the value proposition. The third one is how they handle objections. And the fourth one is how they deal with a customer that ghosts them, right? Those are the most vulnerable moments for a salesperson. That's when you lose control. And as a salesperson, you don't want to lose control, right? You want to be in control of the conversation. So let me actually tell your listeners, let's talk about 2 of those. One of them is how you open. So you go into the sales call, whether it's on Zoom or whether it's in real life, and there's pleasantries, right? How is the weather? How are your kids? And then there's a moment where you have to pivot. And instead of just diving in and saying, I've heard when I talk to sales reps, the 2 top questions that come up is, tell me more about your work, or what are you working on? Or tell me what your problems are. Nobody's going to confess their problems to a sales rep they've just met. They're on to us,
Absolutely.
right? They already know. And so there's a better way to actually open that conversation. And the way that we like to suggest that you open is saying, in talking to other people just like you know how X and Y typically happens, and that X and Y is the unmet need. Well, we at this company have been thinking a lot about that problem. And then you pause. You don't say that you've solved it. Then that's how you create a confessional for your customer to feel much more confident and comfortable to open that door. So that's one very practical way. You know how X and Y happens, in other clients that we visited, you know how X and Y typically happens when you're running this and that. Well, we've been thinking a lot about that in our company. And now you're waiting for the customer to say, go on,
Because their
or
curiosity is going
tell
to
me
kill them,
more.
isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to stop and ask for permission to keep going because the customer could say, we don't have that problem here. And you just know that you're going to be wasting your time. You just
Subtle.
know,
Yeah.
and you could still go through the motions if you want to, but that's not going to be a sale. And so it's risky because you're making a bet. You're making a bet that you know the unmet need. But you know what's a much more expensive bet? The 10 years and tens of millions of dollars that you've spent building that product without actually doing customer research to find out what you're solving. Right? That's a much more risky bet than actually going out on a limb and guessing what the problem is for the customer. Because the customer could be like, we don't have that problem, but we have this other problem. That could also
Which would
happen.
also work.
Totally work. Totally work.
Absolutely.
And if the customer is not in the mood for a sales, they're going to use that as an out. They're going to be like, we don't have that problem. Thanks for stopping by. They're not in a buying mood. You hit them on the wrong day. You know what?
Exactly.
All good. I'll call you later.
Absolutely.
But that's one technique. If you want, we can talk about the ghosting.
So, yeah, please. It's a favorite topic of our listeners. Yeah.
Because none of your listeners have ever experienced that, I'm sure.
Nobody experienced ghosting.
Nor us for that matter. We never get it either now.
So,
I've never even heard of it until recently.
Exactly. You're like 5, 6 meetings in, you've delivered the quote, everything is going swimmingly, and then the customer disappears on you. So here's what not to do. Don't remind them that they've been ghosting you, because there's a heuristic in the human brain to stay consistent with their last decision. So if you go to your favorite restaurant, 80% of the time you order the same thing, because you want to stay consistent with your decision. You notice this. I bet you notice this in your training. If you do multi-day trainings, people come in the second day, they sit exactly in the same seat that they did before. Right. You didn't assign it to them. You didn't ask, but they just sit the same place, right?
Exactly.
Because the people the human brain doesn't want to be inconsistent. It's really painful to be inconsistent. So what you don't do is you say, hey, you've been ghosting me. Like, just checking to see if you got my last email, or I haven't heard from you, are like the wrong ways to open that email or to open that outreach, because the human brain says, oh, I've been ghosting this person. I'm going to continue ghosting this person. The way to do it is to remind them of the last time they actually talked to you. So you can quite literally say, when we spoke on this date at this time, you asked for this. I am just making sure that you have what you need. Or where do we go from here? You ask a question, but you remind them that they've been speaking with you. And that has a far better chance of soliciting a response than saying, just bumping this up on your email list, or, just anything that sort of is a signal that they've been ghosting you is not the right way to go. The signal is like, remind them that they spoke to you last time.
Yeah. So much more positive connotation. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we see a huge drop off from lead generation to them actually responding to the sales rep. And that's why there's more reasons to this, but that's one of the reasons why sales are like, yeah, marketing leads are all garbage, and marketing is like, what are you talking about? We totally and completely, verified every lead, but they're like, well, why aren't they responding to me then? Well,
so as a sales rep responding to a lead, you would remind the customer how they reacted in the first place, wouldn't you?
Yes, absolutely. We actually train salespeople to, instead of saying, hi, I'm Hamid, I'm from Linus, Linus does this and that, I would love to get 15 minutes of your time. Instead, I say, last Thursday, you requested to talk to someone from Linus. My name is Hamid and I'm fulfilling your request. You see, like, stay consistent with your prior actions. So that's the whole idea.
Super. So this is to use the word heuristics in terms of kind of the programming. And are there any other examples or any other scenarios where you would use heuristics?
Heuristics are incredibly powerful because Here's the thing. People act in patterns, right? Then we make decisions in patterns. So I just shared, a few of them with you. One was priming, which is like, I'm primed to act a certain way, and therefore I'm just going to, I'm going to act that way because that's what's expected of me. The other one was consistency as a heuristic. Another heuristic that's really powerful is called availability. And it's essentially, if someone can recount a story of something happening, they are reliving the moment that it happened, and they tend to overestimate how often it happens. Again, another sort of typical sales situation. How often do you have X and Y problem? Is a typical question that a sales rep would want to ask. What you're doing in that situation is you're asking your customer to become a statistician. How often? Let me see. 17%, 15%. I don't know. Like, how am I going to answer this question? The answer they're going to get is not very often, or that never happens. The better question to ask is, tell me a story of when you lost your sample when X and Y happened. And that person could be like, that's never happened to me before. Or they may be like, that's never happened to me, but it happened to a colleague of mine. Or they're going to start telling you about when it happened. And what happens in that situation is that all of that cortisol and all the endorphins and all that's coursing through their veins once more. It's almost now, as a sales rep, you're talking to them the moment that it happened. And you don't even have to ask how often it happens because they're going to overestimate it anyway. There's studies on this. When there's a shark attack in Southern California and they go and ask people how often do sharks attack surfers, people overestimate it by 10 times because they remember the last time that it happened. Availability of a story. It's an available
Super interesting.
example.
It is fascinating. And I think,
Yeah.
we're doing a podcast now. In the podcast world, the podcasts that I love listening to, the ones that tell stories. And, I was doing presentation skills training for a company last week, and we were talking about the importance of storytelling, because when you tell a story, the person listening to the story almost gets a feeling of having lived that experience themselves by listening to the story. So many salespeople don't understand the importance of being able to tell and also listen to stories, because as a kid, that's how we learn, isn't it? We're programmed to tell stories and listen to stories. So if there was one thing that somebody listening to this could take away to do differently, one killer thing that they could do right now as a result of listening to this, and we'll come on to your second book in a second, but having read your first book, what would that be?
So I gave you a few hacks or a few tricks that you can do just to be in touch with your customer a little bit more and orient your customer a little bit more. The biggest thing that I would advocate for: go and ask questions and be curious. You need to be in curiosity mode. And what's interesting about questions is that they have been studied very carefully, and they correlate incredibly highly to successful outcomes in a conversation. So whether that's a sale or whether that's you're trying to get a date, whatever it is, the more questions you ask, the more successful you will be. And there's a tipping point, but it's ridiculously high number of questions. So you are in no danger of asking too many questions. It's most sales reps ask fewer than 3 questions in the first 10 minutes.
Wow.
The most successful
Does it need to be
ones,
genuine? The curiosity, does it need to be genuine?
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. So you need to prepare. What am I curious about? What am I going to ask about? And tell me about your work, or what do you do for work? If you spend 3 minutes and research the person that you're about to talk to, or research the company, literally 3 minutes, you'll be able to craft a finer version of that question. That's all I ask. Literally take 3 minutes and come up with one question that's good, and then just go from there. Let your curiosity handle it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's
absolutely.
the number one thing. And like I said, you're in no danger of asking too many questions, because the tipping point is like 25 questions in 10 minutes.
So ask more, pitch less.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was doing some training last week for one of my customers in a slightly different area. They work in the chemicals industry, and we were in a meeting room for the training, and I noticed the lab was at the end of the corridor. So I said, any chance I can have a look in the lab, because I don't go in labs anymore these days. And I couldn't wait to walk in the lab and start asking, oh, you got one of those? What do you use that for? And how do you do this? And, it's just being nosy, isn't it, really? Being professionally nosy and curious about the world of our customers, which I don't think enough salespeople are.
No.
Hamid, I know you've got a dead stop for time, and I'm very conscious we need to wrap up soon. And thank you so much for your time today. I do want to ask you about your second book. So your first book, I think you said, was in 2011, and you've now produced another book called Not Buying It. So why write another book, and what's different about this book?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, so the first book was called Persuading Scientists. It came out in 2012. I wrote it in 2011, and I honestly thought that book had no life left in it, and because it's so old and it's really out of print, so it's not available anymore. And I just thought, okay, that was done. It's over. But every single week, I got an email from somebody that said, I read your book when I was starting out as a product manager or as a marketing manager or a salesperson, and now I'm leading a team. And boy, would I love to give this to my team. Where can I find it? Because it's not available on Amazon. And so I thought at first, okay, you know what? Let's just dust it off and reprint it. And then I made the mistake of reading it again after so many years. And I was so mortified by how out of date and how sophomoric some of this information was in there that I started to write it again. And then it turned into a whole other book. So a couple of differences and why this book is, I'm excited about this book. Number one, I really advocate for single commercial strategy rather than sales and marketing, irrespective of what side the company is. You need a single commercial strategy.
Absolutely.
And so I talk a lot about this in the book. Techniques and tools that we talked about during this podcast are also written in that book, but in a more formal way of introducing the idea that there's a psychology that your customers are undergoing. How do you understand that psychology? And then how do you use it to your advantage naturally? So that's the whole idea. And as the book progresses, I talk about how to develop those insights that then lead to those provocations or those challenges or whatever it is that, however you want to implement them. And then how do you back them up? And then how do you persuade? What heuristics could be at play? And I even end the book by talking about how change is difficult inside a company. Like, you will have just read this book. You're excited about this. You work in a large company and change seems impossible. Even if you're the CEO, change seems impossible.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I talk about how to basically, what are the tools that you can use to get your own team to be ready for that. So very excited about the book. And it's so far I'm humbled by how much positive feedback I've gotten from it. So really excited that it's
getting
hopefully
a copy of it, and we will of course link to it in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Hamid, for coming on the pod today. It's been fascinating listening to you. I literally could have listened to you for the next hour, but I know you do have a dead stop. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it. I'll definitely be getting a copy of the book, and as I say, we'll link to it in the show notes and also to your LinkedIn profile as well. If you have enjoyed today's episode, dear listener, don't forget to give us a review on Spotify or Apple. It does help us in lots of weird and wonderful ways. And if you've got suggestions for any topic for the podcast, or would even like to become a guest yourself on the podcast, then don't forget to reach out to me through LinkedIn. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks with another episode of The Luxury Choice. Until then, happy selling, and we'll talk to you soon.